Okay, welcome back everyone. I hope you're well caffeinated, strong coffee, and ready to go again for the last panel. We have an excellent lineup for our last panel, and I have to say we have two of the founding members of CCP that were talked about so generously earlier for good reason. But first up, we have Jens Prüfer, who is going to start us off. Jens is the director of the Tilburg Law and Economics Center, TILEC, and professor of economics at the University of East Anglia and deputy director of CCP as well. Go ahead, Jens.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being here. Friday afternoon is a tough call, and now it will be even tougher, I'm sorry, because it's not game theory, but it is theoretical. It is conceptual, kind of. The good part is you will most likely be able to take something with you home. So that's at least what I hope. So this paper is entitled Economic Governance and Institutional Design. It is not about competition policy. But at the very end, I will suggest a framework that is in particular relevant for policymakers who have to implement certain policies, and then the question is how to do this best. And at the very end, I'll take the turn and try to push it over towards competition policy and regulation in order to show that all of what we could do for many, many things, we can also do for competition policy and regulation. And this is why maybe this is also relevant for this audience. That's at least what I hope. If not, please tell me later. Here's a thought experiment. Put yourself in the shoes of a policymaker, not so hard for some of you. And assume there is a rule that you should implement. The rule says, if there is an outbreak of a new coronavirus variant, people should wear face masks. Okay, now how do you get compliance? Well, there's a couple of options. One obvious option is you can enact a new law, a law that says, that punishes not wearing a mask with a hefty fine. Alternatively, you could, for instance, run an information campaign and say, look, it is very ethical to wear a face mask and hence protect the weaker citizens. Consequently, if you're an ethical person, you should wear a face mask. Alternatively, you could run a different information campaign that says, look whether your acquaintances around you wear face masks. And if you see anybody who doesn't do it, just don't interact with that person or yell at them, right? That would be a completely different approach. What to do? I don't know. But I know that the first one, the law, in this case, is probably dominated, right? Because it would require the coercive enforcement of a micro rule about individual behavior of millions of people all of the time. This is very, very, very costly, right? Unlikely to be followed in equilibrium. Consequently, maybe not the ideal thing. Now, the second one, with respect to ethics, it may work with some people. Some people think that, oh yes, actually I'm an ethical person, I want to protect weaker citizens, I'll do it. Probably not too many, but some. And then there may be a third rule, also not ideal, but actually if it is possible, and I will not discuss the details right now, but if it is possible at the beginning of such a rule, to establish a social norm that basically says, look, just don't talk to other people who are not wearing face masks, and there are certain ways how one could establish this a little bit, then it carries a chance. Now, this was only an example. The important part is, this is what I just suggested to you, is an economic governance problem. So we're talking about different ways how a specific rule could be implemented and how you as a policymaker or somebody who wants other people to comply could increase compliance maybe. Okay, economic governance, what on earth is that? Avinash Dixit, in a pretty famous paper in the American Economic Review 2009, defined it as follows. Let me read it out. Economic governance is the structure and functioning of the legal and social institutions that support economic activity and economic transactions by doing three things: protecting property rights, enforcing contracts, and taking collective action to provide physical and organizational infrastructure. Very deep, very rich, hard to understand immediately. So where are we? It focuses on legal and social institutions, and I will define institutions on the next slide. And so legal and social institutions, this is what economic governance does. And they're these institutions are there to solve at least three fundamental economic governance problems, namely property rights protection, contract enforcement, and collective action. And if you think a little bit, kind of then you will see that kind of these three fundamental problems capture a ton of real-world problems, including all buyer-seller relationships and many things that we capture with that have moral hazard and hold-up, and so it's all in there. I will not go into depth here. So more generally, kind of then this field of economic governance can also be understood as dealing with the implementation of rules, including laws and policies. Now, institutions. What on earth is an institution? And I find it very funny because even in kind of today, kind of that term was used several times, and let's say not in the official way. Not at least not in the way that institutional economists use the term. So kind of the most famous of those is Douglas North, Nobel laureate, who wrote in 1990 very famously, "Institutions are the rules of the game, and organizations are the players." What does this imply? It implies the CCP is not an institution. The CCP is an organization. Clifford Chance, the Bank of England, and the University of East Anglia, all organizations. They are not institutions. Institutions are rules. First thing. Second thing, in order to operationalize this idea a little bit, kind of, and not only kind of engage in semantic discussions, we draw on Avner Graef, kind of Stanford economic historian, a game theorist, and a brilliant person, and he came up with the following distinction. So he said, look, we must look at the level of one transaction. Transaction is, for instance, one buyer-seller transaction, or somebody produces something, or now we all sit in this room, right? That's one transaction. And so we need at least two players here. And then we distinguish between two types of transactions, so-called central transactions and auxiliary transactions. What does a central transaction do? The central transaction is the central transaction. That's the one where value is created or not. That is, for instance, if we all behave well, we behave as we should. I speak, you be quiet, then we change roles. Kind of, then this is most likely efficient. And now, in a very, very abstract term, think about a prisoner's dilemma game, kind of where basically each of us has the choice to do one of two things, and the one is what we call cooperation. That's basically do as the rule says, or defection, do not do as the rule says, do what you want to do. Sometimes what you want to do also is kind of in the cooperation thing, but we'll come to that. So that's a central transaction, right? And so here it is clearly efficient if people kind of, and so we can also show that, kind of it is efficient if people behave according to the rule, so if they cooperate. And now assume that we have a rule that says all players should cooperate. For instance, in a buyer-seller relationship, the seller is supposed and promises to deliver a good with high quality, and the buyer is supposed to pay the agreed-on price in time. Right? That's cooperation. Defection would be I deliver low quality, or I pay late, or with a discount, or whatever. Right? Now, so that's the central transaction. Now the key question is, okay, how do we make people comply? Because if you know what the prisoner's dilemma is, there's a very strong prediction, and equilibrium and dominant strategies, that says people will defect here, unless we have a certain institutional infrastructure, right? So we must convince them somehow to comply with the rule. And this is what we need the auxiliary transaction for. The auxiliary transaction gets only triggered in the case that somebody defects in the central transaction, such that somebody does not behave well, in general terms, right? And then it depends on the specific governance institution, and this is what the core of the talk now is, kind of how to get this cooperation in the central transaction. So if I take all of this together, North and the central transaction and the auxiliary transaction, then we have a proper definition of an institution, which is coming from Graef, and which says as follows. An institution sets, first, the players and the behavioral rules in the central transaction. Who should do what, which creates value. Second, we also know who are the players and the behavioral rules in the auxiliary transaction. The policeman is set to take a thief and put him to prison in case the thief steals something. That would be one way of an auxiliary transaction. And finally, the entire system must be self-enforcing. This means if we have a fantastic set of rules, but nobody follows it because it's not incentive compatible, no institution. Institution requires that the system is set up smartly, such that kind of people actually do what they're supposed to do. So now applying this still in general terms, but applying this. And for this we will talk about kind of one specific economic governance problem. I told you, so Dixit defined 3. I will pick out 1, contract enforcement. So you think contract enforcement, you think there is kind of you buy a car and there's a seller selling you a car and you promise to pay 2 weeks later or whatever, right? So that's and if everybody does as he or she should, then we call it cooperation, right? Now the question is, how do we get cooperation? And for this, this beautiful kind of figure, which cost us 3.5 years to draw, it's not for its artist value. This can help us, because this is a typology of contract enforcement institutions, or more specifically, a typology of economic governance institutions. Now, first, so what on earth do you see here? First, at the top, you see 8 different boxes. Each of these boxes contains the name of one contract enforcement institution. So you see things like courts, regulators, criminal organizations, arbitrators, information intermediaries, social networks, bilateral interaction, and internal value systems. Now below this, you will have between any 2 of these institutions, you will have a clear delineation mark, such that all institutions on the left have one characteristic. For instance, here, all on the left are private institutions, and all on the right are public. And so you can, and thereby we can very clearly map any really existing institution into this scheme, because we can always say, now, is it private or is it public? What is the enforcement technology? Is it centralized? Is it decentralized? Blah, 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 right? So that's very straightforward. Now then, how do you apply this? Because basically, this is it's not rocket science. It's just you need a bit of clarity here, but how you apply this, if you have a specific economic governance problem, is basically you start on the left. And I will tell you later why you start on the left. And then you check. So on the left, it says internal value systems. So internal value systems refers to morality, to ethics, to religious rules that you truly believe in. You act in a certain way because you want it. It does not require any other person on the planet. You act in a certain way. You pay your children the promised pocket money because you want it, not because they threaten you with something, right? So, and the question is, at the very left, can the internal value system solve the economic governance problem, contract enforcement in this case, or not? If yes, problem solved, fantastic. If not, you move one institution to the right and check here, it says bilateral interaction. That refers to bilateral repeated interaction, folk theorem logic. So I may cooperate because otherwise you will not cooperate with me in the future. Hence, I forego certain value from cooperation in the future. Knowing this by backward induction, I better cooperate today. In certain situations. If the situation that you're studying is not such a situation, you move one box to the right, and to the right, and to the right, and to the right. So due to time constraints, I will not go through all of this. By the way, this is the very, very short version of a 4-hour executive teaching thing I've done, also at the Commission. And so feel invited. If you find this interesting, contact me. But this is basically how you do it. And so at the end, you have a specific problem. You have these 8 boxes. And in the end, you can see, okay, this would work, this would work, this would not work. No, this would not work. So those institutions that would work, that would solve your problem, we call them effective institutions. And there may be more than one effective institution. And now comes the trick, because in the end, we want to identify the efficient institution. And the efficient institution is the leftmost of all the effective ones. So if internal value systems can solve your problem, fantastic. Yeah, then we do not even have to bother about the rest. Why is that? Because it's super cheap. If people do not cheat other people because they feel for ethical reasons, they should not do it, we do not need law, we do not need police, we do not need any kind of social shitstorms, right? It's all not necessary. It's very cheap. So basically, these 8 boxes are ordered from with respect to the costs of using them. The leftmost box is very cheap, and the rightmost box, courts plus police, is very, very expensive. very effective, but very, very expensive, right? This implies we only want to use them if we have no other choice. And this is maybe this is my key message to this audience, because if you work as a regulator, which is slightly different than a general court, or if you work on behalf of the state, kind of then maybe you're used to start there, to start with what we call public ordering, and kind of use the enforcement powers of the state and the entire apparatus to solve a given problem. But very often, there are other, much more efficient ways of dealing with the problem, right? Okay, that's basically what I just said. So now having said that, let me try to apply this. How much time do you have?
7 minutes.
Okay, great. So I'll be short. And so what I will do right now, I will briefly speak about how this kind of typology can be used to address one specific problem, namely to solve the trust problem in cloud computing. So because people have not enough kind of trust, such that their private data in the cloud kind of will be kept private, or that their business data, if they're a small firm or so, kind of really will be running there, and they can use it and access it whenever they need to, right? So I will not go into the details. I would need much more time for that, but kind of I only want to sketch kind of how this can be applied. So the first thing I want to convince you is that trusting privacy in the cloud is an economic governance problem. Why is that? On the one hand side, kind of research has shown that kind of cloud computing is a very efficient technology. Kind of it has the growth rates of more than 20% each year over the past 10 years. So that's it's skyrocketing, and we could use it for many more things. So that's great. Good upside potential. At the same time, you have a downside because the privacy concerns. We're talking about a very international environment, kind of where data that you have in the cloud here could easily, by the cloud service provider, be transferred from here to there, to that country, and maybe it's here, maybe it's copied, you do not know. As a user, very hard to kind of to get grasp of, right? This naturally kind of diminishes the kind of the utility from using cloud services, at least in expected terms, and you have a classical economic governance problem, namely a contract enforcement problem. Why is that? Assume that we have two players, a cloud service provider, so the seller, and a user. Can be private user, can be business user. And the cloud service provider says, look, I promise you get high quality services. That means I have established a high level of data security, high level of accountability, both with technical, with organizational measures, and what have you. Right? So that's the promise. And then the question is, does the user trust this promise? And then kind of we can kind of ask, how can we incentivize the cloud service provider to keep their contractual obligations and to install procedures that actually protect the accountability needs of users? And how can we make the user believe and trust in this? Right? So that's the key thing here. I have two papers that are already kind of published here, kind of the first one in a very short one, kind of where it solves the economic governance problem, basically what I want to convey today, kind of which among these 8 theoretically available institutions picks one, and then the second paper kind of goes into depth and models with game theory, kind of the organizational governance or corporate governance, detailing much more kind of how the problem can be solved. But let me focus on the first part. Thank you. So that was the picture I already showed you. So okay, how can we solve this trusting privacy in cloud computing problem? Okay, first thing we could think, for instance, okay, maybe litigation, maybe a new law that would help kind of we make cloud service providers liable if kind of their data security levels are below what they promise. They get a fine, they go to prison, something bad happens to them from the state. However, due to this multinational environment, where kind of one jurisdiction only has limited scope, limited enforcement scope, plus you have a super highly innovative kind of technological landscape which is developing quickly, which makes it hard for the legislator and for potential regulators kind of to keep up with the Joneses here, and the Joneses of the cloud service providers, kind of that is very, very difficult. So the brief version without more time is public ordering will not do the job. It will not be sufficient. Okay, so that doesn't work. What else? Actually, at the very left, we had the internal value systems. Well, to be honest, cloud computing is this global industry where you do not ever kind of personally know many other people. So doing this ethically and telling cloud service providers you should not cheat is probably not enough, right? So that will not do the job. A criminal organization may be effective, but only in the short term. We do not really want to hire the mafia to go after cloud service providers and kick their kneecaps, right? Also, doesn't really sound too attractive. So basically, we have a couple of institutions kind of left here in the middle. Importantly, 3 of them are completely based on reputation-based mechanism. And very often, reputation-based mechanisms, kind of enforcement mechanisms, are very effective. The problem here is, it has been shown empirically that online feedback systems are unreliable, and we know theoretically that kind of information about the behavior of other people that is told within social networks and then prevents people from interacting with others in the future. This works as long as the players are rather symmetric and as long as the total number of players is limited. Not given in cloud computing, no chance. Very asymmetric sizes, very asymmetric knowledge about technology, and So consequently, online feedback system or anything that is completely reliant on on reputation also will not do the job. Basically, so what this suggests is that what the box that here is called arbitrators, which is an organization, basically an association, which has some enforcement powers because they can exact a fine, but are still private. That is the rough sketch that comes out of this economic governance analysis. Now then we go for the next step, and specifically one type of arbitrator here would be a so-called, let me just jump over all of this. Here we are, would be a so-called certification agency. So the thing is certifying cloud service providers that can be shown that is efficient and will work. The problem is that all of the theories we have about certification do not really work because they're one-layered, there's still moral hazard, blah, 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 blah. So I cannot show the details here, but if I conclude, then you get the gist. So what I claim is the initial problem, underutilization of cloud services, can be solved, in practice mitigated, by first understanding the problem as an economic governance problem, which is contract enforcement. Secondly, to identify what the central transaction is, selling cloud services. And then to design an auxiliary transaction, and this auxiliary transaction basically is to establish here what I call a cloud association, which is a private international non-profit club of cloud service providers who share control over the certification protocol with user representatives and source certification of cloud service providers out to for-profit certifiers, yet another category of players, but that is necessary to keep everybody incentive compatible, who then depend on a license of the cloud service provider for future business. So I just claimed that. I didn't have the time to prove this to you. There is a full paper that proves, and I'm happy to speak more. Importantly, and this is now the turn back to competition policy in my final 10 seconds, I claim that that this typology, this methodology, of starting with the 8 economic governance institutions, and then saying no, yes, maybe, yes. So that can narrow down the set of potentially effective institutions, and then within that, the efficient institution for nearly every problem, including competition policy and regulation problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jens, for being perfectly on the bell. Would welcome 2 questions at this point for our first paper. Do we have any? Just down there in the front. Can we get a microphone? Thank you.
Elliot Bird, Payment Systems Regulator. I was just curious, with your 8 institutions, have you ever found an example where a criminal organisation is the right answer?
Excellent question. So I've applied this only to 2 cases, I have to admit, because in the end it requires more thinking than it looks like. This was one where the arbitrators came out, and the other one were regulators were the efficient institution. I do not know. I can only say that they must be there. because kind of they combine specific features of being on the one hand side private and being a private institution, but at the same time kind of reserving the right to coerce things. So not because the enforcement technology is just with the state, right? It is coercive. It is not only ostracism. It's not only the threat. If you do this, then I will not, or we will not, or nobody will ever interact with you in the future. So, but it's a fair question. So not yet, but maybe it will come.
And one more question. If not, I have one. Oh, we've got two. I'm going to hand it to Andrea in the back. Oh, that was Sean instead of Andrea.
Let's get the other mic because people online can only.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think people can hear me now. So you've given one example and now discussed another possibility, but without a real example to support it. I do wonder whether community policing might be a little bit in that same box in some aspects, but more generally, I wanted you to comment on whether you've applied this analysis to many other areas of governance and decision-making, or whether really you've done it just in a few cases.
I mean, so these in-depth analyses I've only done for two, kind of, where basically the paper behind the cloud computing thing is one. But I mean, it's relatively straightforward to construct other cases, namely, of course, all of those kind of inspired by the real world. There are many things where we which we saw, for instance, by social networks. Just imagine one of us right now behaves really badly. What will happen? Well, the first thing is we do not talk to that person over drinks, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is maybe at some point Sean or Peter or whoever kind of comes in and says, please, would you kindly, whatever, behave well, right? So these are very societally relevant kind of enforcement mechanisms which in the end are not coercive. It will take a long time until somebody gets physical, right? So that's, and importantly, kind of the enforcement technology here may not be so much what to do right now if one person misbehaves right now, but what to do in the future. Maybe this person will not be invited to future CCP conferences, right? That is possible. That's ostracism. The enforcement technology is ostracism, and it may be enforced either by kind of this one player called CCP, but it could also be enforced by other players in the room who say, look, I work for Regulator X or for University Y, and in the future, actually, no, this person really misbehaved. I will never invite this person. This is social network enforcement. And the thing is, because we know it or we expect it, it's damned effective for this kind of problem. Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry, we're going to have to move on to the next speaker, but we will have time at the end for discussion. So I've got to restart my thing. Now we have two speakers. So Catherine, I think you're first. Catherine is now Emeritus Professor, one of the founding members of CCP, which means she gets to use all of her time to just do the research that she's interested in. And then Morten who is still with us as Professor of Law, will continue.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm not quite sure what Jens's paper says about the behaviour of speakers and chairs, but I'll do my best to allow enough time for everybody. Oh, sorry, I was there. Just to say that we thank Natalia Musanova for research assistance here, and indeed the CCP for funding it, so thank you very much for that. And I should, for information, let you know that I have been a reporting member of the Competition Commission and a non-executive director of Ofwat. That probably colours some of what I say. So it may seem a little bit odd in a session about the future to talk about the past. And of course, regulation of utilities in particular is 40 years old this year, just as CCP is 20 years old. So I think it is quite helpful to have a quick look at the history and to see what sort of questions regulation has been trying to answer and how that has changed over time. picking out particularly two aspects, competition and distributional questions, and looking at some of the comments that have been made about that, and then seeing what implications we think that might have for the future. And I leave all the difficult things to my younger colleague here, who will take over. Quite a lot of what I say, actually what both of us say, has already been said, which I think is a great tribute to the integration of this conference, but it does mean I'll be able to skip over some things a little bit more quickly, and perhaps it's a slightly different angle that people bring to the same facts, if you like. So, privatisation was where we started. We don't need to go through dates and so on, but I'll draw your attention to the end of this slide, where the original objectives, well, perhaps the last 3 points, the government, as I think Martin Cave mentioned, had a timing consistency issue when it set the first price caps, because it also wanted to sell shares. And so it wanted a very light touch regulation, of course, in order to get lots of money for the shares. When the regulator first reset that price cap, they had fewer questions and conflicts than at the initial development of that price cap. And the objectives that they were trying to meet by using this one instrument, really, were constraining monopoly power to protect consumers, encouraging investment in the industries. Many of them came from a background of being very underinvested for all sorts of reasons around public finance rules. And they had a relatively simple task at that stage. Now, it became relatively easy, of course, to add new duties. It's ever so difficult to remove them, because everybody who is adversely affected by removing something will tell you about it, but the beneficiaries generally won't know and won't do that. Some of the changes were very politically motivated post the election of the 1997 Labour government, and in particular, of course, they dropped the ambition to renationalise these industries, and so they wanted to do something really quite drastic in terms of regulation. They changed the primary duty to include one of consumer protection. They introduced low-income consumers as a particular group. We've heard already that some particular groups were protected, but they became more protected, in particular low-income rather than other characteristics. So this very explicitly distributional. And this coincided also with an organisational change from a single Director General to boards. This gave rise to a Christmas tree effects, which have been developed by Michael Harker, who we heard from earlier. He flashed it by you, but didn't dwell on it, and Dave Reeder. And I just wanted to draw your attention to 3 strands in that, and dwell in particular on the consumer, competition and environmental strands. So here is the Christmas tree. You can't read the detail, and that doesn't really matter. But I would draw your attention, as I say, to these 3 aspects. The consumer protection starts, I'm not sure how effective, it's quite effective, starts down here as a secondary duty until the Utilities Act 2000. This is off gas and then off gem when it became part of that. Then it went up to here and became a primary duty, and it's still there as a primary duty. So I draw your attention to that bit. The next one to look at is competition, which starts off down here somewhere, I think. It's orange. I can't even read it myself. Anyway, it bumps along and ends up not as a primary duty, but here as a secondary duty, so to speak, or a second order duty. The environment is more difficult to pick out, but I mention it because it's becoming so important now. So there are some green boxes, which are the environment down here, quite a long way down, included, but a long way down, and then carbon targets and budgets, and then it's going to rise up the hierarchy, I think. And of course, this is incomplete in the sense that the growth duty, which was added less than a month ago to Ofgem's duties, is not included here. So I just want to unpack a couple of those streams a little bit more. this is really repeating what I've said, that the consumer duty was prioritised post the Labour government, and this big change to include not only specific groups, those of pensionable age, the disabled, people who are chronically sick, people who live in rural areas, a purely political addition when it was all in the House of Lords, but now low-income consumers. So that seems to me to change the balance. And there are continuing discussions, as we've heard, about the role of regulators and the role of regulated industries in protecting consumers who are vulnerable, both discussions in principle and discussions in practice. And the role of competition evolved. The gas industry, which of course off-gas was initially regulating, was privatised against a background of some contentiousness around competition even before it was privatised. So that was why competition was in the initial act, I think. Interestingly, the promotion of competition to an important duty was slightly downgraded in the wash-up. And you all now know what a wash-up is because we've just had it in closing this Parliament before the 2010 election. So this was an outgoing Labour government which included that competition was an important tool to be used to protect consumers, but that the regulator had a duty to consider other means of protecting consumers as well. And it stayed in that role. In fact, I guess there's a question of, is competition an answer or a question? Is it a process or a result? And we had some echoes of that in the 2016 CMA energy investigation, and we indeed have had the author of the minority report here yesterday, but we didn't ask him about that. Environment clearly has been central to Ofgem reforms. Social and economic guidance was produced quite frequently after 2000, as we see in these years. There was a major review in 2011, again an incoming, in this case, coalition government, which reaffirmed the principles of economic regulation. And these were reaffirmed not very long ago, as you see, with various government commitments made. The growth objective was extended also to Ofgem very recently, and we've had some discussion of what that means. And I wanted just to show you that similar things have happened both for the water regulator and for the telecoms regulator. Christmas trees abound. It's only a Christmas tree if you stand it up, of course, but sideways Christmas trees. There was this major review in 2011. The government committed to strategy and policy statements. You remember all those ones that came up until 2011? All those guidances. Now they're going to have formal strategy and policy statements, but it took 13 years to issue the first one to Ofgem. So perhaps intentions don't always follow into actions. They would ensure that the regulator's objectives are clear and appropriately prioritised. I won't ask for any comments on that. Take opportunities to simplify and clarify regulators' objectives and not seek to add objectives. So this is what was said in 2011 and recently reaffirmed. So I wondered what had happened to public confidence in traditional regulation, and I just wondered whether the question that we're trying to solve by regulation has changed. Is there a greater appetite for intervention, I wonder, following pandemic and energy crises? There's the irony of the most extensive energy intervention, which Andy talked about this morning, the price guarantee, which Truss and Kwarteng introduced, terribly non-interventionist, but a huge intervention and very costly. It just feels like an anomaly now, looking back. There are big issues in water around trust of the regulator, and in energy, I think the challenges around decarbonisation, and perhaps in the retail market, the tension between competition and trying to protect particular people, as well as competition leading to predictable outcomes, is a major problem, or a major challenge, perhaps. We don't have problems, do we? Only challenges. And so Really what I wanted to do was leave that there and hand over to Morten to explore more the implications of some of these issues for principles and the future.
Thank you very much. So just to sum it up, the number of objectives have ballooned across the board. We saw the Christmas trees, like game trees, lying down. The number of instruments, on the other hand, has not really seen the same expansion, so we're still talking about RPI-X type things, and then two of the nuclear options, either refer them to the competition authority or remove their license. With several of these objectives that we've seen, there are potential conflicts. So introducing fairness as an objective, if you are relying on markets are not generally very good. We're going from thinking about consumer surplus with a producer surplus constraint, they need to be able to finance themselves, to looking within consumer surplus, and markets are unlikely to help us deliver that, so something else will have to be done. You need to have a different instrument. Adding environmental concerns emphasizes intergenerational fairness. Previous session, people mentioned that, so there you go. The growth agenda that was added involves more investment in R&D tend to have a sort of inverse U relationship between market structure and activity. So we know generally to get more innovation, we need to slow down markets a little bit. So we need to put something in place. So that is another challenge there. But there's another thing, because if you have a great variety of objectives, that exposes the regulators to lobbying or pressure or challenge. And this comes from all sorts of different directions, such as the regulated firms, obviously, but also other firms, direct rivals, or anybody in the vertical chain, consumers, consumer representatives, but it's not just consumers, because if we talk about media, about environment, then it's also citizens. The media gets interested. Sometimes things get very politically salient. We've seen that with water in the last 2 or 3 years, and continues here with water. We saw it earlier with electricity. The government changes and have particular views about what they want and are trying to get those results. And then, of course, one would imagine that not all organizations are very homogeneous and kind of, there are probably people inside organizations that have different ideas about which of these different objectives we should be pursuing at any given time. Not all groups are likely to be effective, not all likely to have voice. And there is, within each of these groups, significant heterogeneity as well. What is, however, the case is that lobbying, influence activities are not costless. Just as it's not costless to multi-home, despite the fact that we don't seem to very often allow for that, it is not costless for people to lobby, and it is not costless to protect yourself against lobbying. So these costs have to be accounted for somewhere in asking ourselves whether we are achieving what it is we're trying to achieve. Now, having multiple objectives is not necessarily a problem. We have techniques such as multi-criteria optimization to deal with it technically. But where there are trade-offs, then you need to identify appropriate weights. And then there's a question about where do these weights come from? Yeah, and that's really a question about the independence of regulators, whether the regulator chooses it, technocrats chooses it, or democratic deficit, which is democratically you would want this to be a decision by Parliament. Now, whichever does it has got a significant effect on regulatory predictability. And here are 2 of the 4 priorities expressed in the 2023 Economic Regulator Policy Paper: clear strategy direction to support effective long-term investment, transparency and consistency. Economic regulators must provide a stable and predictable environment for investment to thrive whilst protecting consumers in these markets. Okay. So we need certainty in order to get all this investment, but a system with so many objectives has much more uncertainty. Okay, so are we asking too much? Are we asking the right questions? And how do we really know that? And that goes back to what Catherine was on about. Sometimes we need to step back and ask ourselves, what is the fundamental question to which regulation is the answer? Okay, now I want to move on to say a little bit about today, about a lot of the digital markets that we talked about, because I think some of what we have seen here is relevant. On one hand, given the various pressures and the various challenges that regulators have found themselves in, and not just the water regulator, it's kind of funny that we want to do more regulation, not less. So slightly ironic, possibly. But there's also something else that makes this desire to regulate the big platforms, the gatekeepers, whatever you want to call them, interesting. One is there's a big difference. The regulator, the utility regulators are dealing with firms that are in some sense smaller than them. When we're talking about the platforms, the CMA will be trying to regulate somebody who is a lot bigger than them, and where one option is simply to leave the market. These businesses are much more complex. I would argue that the theory of harm is still not that clearly established. And the architecture also differs. So these regulators, at least in the UK, are independent. The DMU sits within the CMA. So it sits inside. It's not that the CMA is somebody with which they have concurrent power. It sits within. Nonetheless, there might be some lessons that we can learn, at least maybe we can try. So the DMU seems, at least, on the face of it, to have multiple objectives, unless you tell me that actually these three things mean the same thing: the fair dealing objective, the open choices objective, and the trust and transparency objective. I've highlighted some words that I think I would struggle to define exactly what they meant, because there's a lot of those that are very fluffy. So multiple objectives that are not necessarily super clear would give a lot of opportunity for lobbying, for influencing, for arguments, for that matter, for appeal if there are decisions. It's not just that. It's not just about numbers of objectives. Interestingly, DMU's investigative tool, the PCI, pro-competition intervention, is similar to market investigation. It uses the same test, adverse effect on competition. There are also subtle differences. The thing I cannot figure out, and I've asked a few people who haven't told me, is could the CMA decide when they were looking at one of the gatekeepers that they're a dominant firm, so let's do a 102. This is an industry that is not functioning, so we'll do a market investigation under the old rules. Or is this a platform and we'll just deal with them under the PCI? Because they'll be quite different. And at least if you contrast the last two, the market investigation and the PCI, they'll either involve all the firms in the industry because it's a market investigation, and so they all have to spend time talking to the CMA, or just the platform. I can guess what the platform would probably prefer here. But what happens? So there's scope here for quite a lot of influencing to go on. The new objectives are far from clear. And they seem also to be focused on process, not outcomes. So have you done the right thing, then you're good. Whatever happens, whatever the actual outcome is. The CMA, as DMU, is enforcing with similar tools but different objectives. The CMA and DMU will not have exactly the same objectives, so what hat are they wearing, and how will they be sure that they know? How do they ensure that they know what exactly it is? And then there are other areas where we get into some tensions. On the one hand, you have the competition authority, the CMA or the DMU. On the other hand, you have the information commissioner, because GDPR also comes into the picture. Now, from recent documents, there's a clear awareness that there is an issue here. But those of us who spent far too many years looking at information problems know that our intuition is often not a great guide to what is eventually going to come out of the model that we're trying to solve. Information problems are not straightforward. They're challenging and they're difficult to predict exactly what the outcomes are. So there are lots of avenues to explore for anybody who's trying to influence what is going on here. And then, are we even asking the right questions? So when I sit around here, we talked a lot about the economics of these gatekeepers. But we're also in an election period, and we're worried about fake news and influencing the democratic process. All right? And maybe that's really what we should be worried about. Somebody yesterday mentioned ChatGPT and the impact on education. We've just finished marking exams and coursework, and at least sometimes feel, though often not able to prove, that there may have been, allegedly, possibly, who knows, some influence of some sort of algorithm. Or there may be even other questions that we ought to think about. So the other thing that I'm sort of left with here, a little bit like with energy, are we actually asking the right questions here? Okay, so overall conclusion to this is we observe a clear tendency to move beyond simple economic goals for regulation. And in that respect, one could wonder what might happen to the DMU's objectives over time. Will they also balloon? Will we see another Christmas tree there? Questions and dimensions of answer and objectives have evolved, but not always explicitly. And a new focus on process rather than outcomes, easy to assess. And what will the next question's answer be for utilities and DMU when we get to the next election? We'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Morten. I apologize for the obnoxious ring. I do have the phone on silent and I don't know how to turn it off from happening anyway. Okay, do we have 2 questions for Morten and Catherine? I do want to throw out one little bit, because right here at the end you said democracy, education, other things, but you didn't mention the cooperation forum that includes Ofcom and the ICO and the CMA, which is quite organizationalized to avoid using institutions as anything other than Jens has defined it. But it has a secretariat and a director now, and they are in regular communication. And Ofcom is not just an economics regulator, right? In a big way. ICO is not at all an economics regulator. So is there potential there?
Well, there'll certainly be a lot more. There'll be a lot more objectives to try and handle, for sure.
Yeah.
Be interesting negotiations, and again, you worry what will happen. You wonder what will happen if the conclusion they come up with is politically unattractive, for example.
I mean, I think it's an interesting thing. What happens when these Christmas trees overlap, right? And where are the coordination mechanisms needed, and I guess the robustness of those coordination mechanisms. Sorry, I'm dominating, but I did open it up. Sean, do we have one down here? Yeah. Okay, I'll go. Sean had one in the last round. I'll take these 2 questions here. That's okay. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Sean. I said to Israel and the woman down in front, because Sean, I'm sorry, you had it. Yeah. Oh.
I might have it then.
Sorry, Juliet Young of What? My observation is to you talk, I wonder how much of the proliferation in growth duty is about the change in thinking about what people want. So perhaps back in the 80s, you had a really 80s view, all customers care about is the price that they get, and that's what economic regulators should deliver. And now I think we know that people care about what the price that they get, the service, environment, what other people are paying. They care about dividends and pay per se, not just the sort of intermediate outcome. So maybe that's what the proliferation of duties reflects.
That certainly seems logical. And one thing you can wonder about, and this is what Catherine said, it's easy to add some, but it's hard to throw some out, whether some of the concerns are actually still there. The other difficulty, and this is the difficulty with regulation as we're planning more generally, is that even if we know what, we need to know who it is who wants what, and then hope we have the instrument to give them, each of them, what they want. And if not, again, we have these trade-offs that we need to figure out based on.
Could you pass the mic to Israel down there?
So, my name is Israel, Payment Systems Regulator. Before I joined the PSR, I was at the Financial Conduct Authority, And I was very proud to be one of the responsible for implementation of the new secondary objective of the competitiveness of the UK economy in the FCA. I don't know what it means very well. I've had to explain it multiple times. I don't know how it bites really at the end. And so my question is more in the sense of, you see a proliferation of objectives and duties. How much of that is just things that at the start we cared about already, we just had never written down? And how much of that is, okay, somebody's lobbying me about this thing, I'm going to write it somewhere here. But at the end, in terms of the impact, it doesn't really make that much of a difference.
Well, yes, I mean, and I think you've hit on something that maybe as economists we want to be able to measure things and put them in order and balance them. And there are soft objectives and soft powers. So maybe I'm glad that you're proud of it, and maybe it's to remind the FCA that that's one of the things they should be doing. But you can't actually measure it afterwards. I think it's just then raises questions about what happens if you're challenged on that. Does it enable the FCA to be challenged? And what is the role, for example, if the government were to change, what is the role of an incoming government in saying, we think you should care more about competitiveness and less about something else? And is that legitimate? Is it democratic? I don't think I know the answer to those questions. Sorry. But congratulations.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. And on your training places.
We're just trying to keep it, live and exciting.
Dynamic.
Okay, so next we're going to hear from Inge Graef, who is also from the University of Tilburg University, where she is Associate Professor of Competition Law, and she's also affiliated with TILEC and with TILT, and a good collaborator of ours. Go ahead, Inge.
Yeah, thank you. So I will be speaking about market investigation tools. We have already heard about it in the previous presentation, because this is something that the Dutch Competition Authority, the ACM, is now pleading for as an expansion of its existing competition toolkit. So market investigation tool allows a competition authority to intervene in a market to impose a remedy without establishing a violation of the competition rules. So this gives a large amount of discretion to the competition authority, but it's meant to address structural market problems where there is no violation of the competition rules, but still harms that the regulator finds needs to be addressed. So this discussion in the Netherlands and also in other countries has been happening now. Some countries like the UK already have these tools in place. Germany is the latest addition since last summer. In the Netherlands, this is now being discussed, also partly accelerated after a study that we did with a group of TILEC researchers for the Dutch Economics Ministry, where we were asked to assess whether the Dutch abuse of dominance provision is still effective. And as a follow-up to that study, we also did a paper for the Journal of European Competition Law and Practice, which focuses more specifically on the idea of introducing a market investigation tool as a possible way to make enforcement in the area of abuse of dominance more effective. So to start off, to give you a short summary of what we found in our study, is that we have several reasons to believe that currently abuse of dominance cannot be effectively enforced in the Netherlands. So this is due to the lack of clarity about what is exactly abuse of dominance. Extensive economic analysis is included, especially after the more economic approach to competition law has been introduced. But this economic evidence is not always conclusive. And it has expanded a lot the cases, the decisions, and it added a lot of complexity. We have also seen that the standard of proof is very high, and that competition authorities are often receiving complaints or signals about market problems that may not necessarily constitute abuse of dominance, but that still require them to screen signals and to decide whether to open up an investigation or not. So based on these findings in our study, we came up with 14 recommendations for the Dutch Economics Ministry and for the Competition Authority, the ACM. And one of them was to investigate whether it's desirable to introduce additional instruments, so to expand the toolkit of the Competition Authority and to address some of these problems that we have outlined. This is indeed something, the introduction of the market investigation tool, that the ACM has been pleading for also before our study already, and this is something that is now seriously discussed in the Dutch competition concept. This was a workshop that was happened last November, where at the request of the ministry, the Dutch competition community came together to discuss what this competition tool could be like, if it's indeed desirable to have it, how it should be designed, and also what the safeguard should be to make sure that this instrument that gives a large discretion to the competition authority fits within the Dutch context and also adequately considers rights of defense of those market players that suddenly may have to comply with remedies, even though there is no violation of any legal rules. So I will take you through the 4 reasons why we believe that abuse of dominance is currently difficult to enforce in the Netherlands, and then I will explain how potentially market investigation tool can be effective to do that, and if so, how it should be designed, also comparing the UK instrument and the German instrument. So the first 2 reasons that we have identified is the lack of clarity about the legal norm and the extensive economic analysis. So in competition and abuse of dominance, you have to go through different steps. You have to define the market, establish dominance, establish the abuse, and then often also pay attention to efficiency defenses. So this whole process is quite long, and in most of the different steps, there's no clear standards, there's little general rules, and every element in a case can matter. Running cases, you can argue, has become more complex as more economics has been introduced, and parties often challenge everything in the case and also have the incentives to do so. And here what is also relevant to keep in mind is that parties, when they bring up an appeal before the court, they are allowed to bring up new evidence that the court has to consider. However, the competition authority cannot do that, so they have to defend the case based on the decision that they already took. Which also means that they have to be very careful already during the investigation, responding to all the arguments that the parties have already made. So just to give one simple illustration of a case that happened at the EU level, which was about company in Lithuania and Latvia about the transport of oil, Baltic Rail, where it was about a dominant firm that removed part of a rail track to prevent rival entry. So when I teach competition, this is like a nice example to explain what it means exclusionary abuses. But nevertheless, despite the fact that you could argue this is quite a straightforward case, it took quite long for the Commission to adopt a decision, and only 6 years after the decision, there's a final appeal. The general court judgment is over 400 paragraphs. So of course you cannot make any conclusive remarks just about these simple facts, but it does show that competition law can be quite complicated. Then when we were reaching the end of our study, which was published in May last year, in March, 2 months before, the Commission launched an initiative to reform Article 102. One could argue this also partly may have to do with the complexity of abuse of dominance cases. So you also see that this situation that we found to be existing at the Dutch level also had a broader relevance, where also at the EU level you see the Commission now acting to try to reform the abuse of dominance provision and potentially make it more enforceable again. So then moving on to another reason that we found is that the very high standard of proof. And here you have to keep in mind that competition authorities, when they impose fines, their decisions have a quasi-criminal character, which means that the firms have protection in the area of human rights. So meaning, for instance, that Article 6 of the ECHR applies, which gives parties' right to a fair trial. And this also has the effect that the court has full jurisdiction over decisions and has to look at every element of the decision very closely. Beyond that, there is also the presumption of innocence in the Charter, and you also see that the courts at EU level take this very seriously. So you see a quote here on the slide: "Any doubt in the mind of the court must operate to the advantage of the dominant firms," which comes from the Android General Court judgment. So you see that these companies have quite strong protection. And at the Dutch level, that's also something that we saw. So Dutch courts, of course, also have to keep in mind these human rights protections. And the standard of proof that is applied by the Dutch courts is one of beyond reasonable doubt. So this is something that has been explicitly stated in the case you see here, which was about the Nederlandse Spoorwegen, which is basically the Dutch railway company, where the ACM decision was annulled both by the court in first instance and also by the appeal court. So the Ennis, as it is abbreviated, was accused by the ACM of abusing its dominance by obtaining confidential information that it has used allegedly in a public bidding. It is a bit of a peculiar case, but the most peculiar aspect maybe is that the case was not lost on the abuse, so establishing the abuse, but rather on whether there was a dominant position. So although the NS has a 100% market share on the part that was actually relevant for abuse and a 90% market share overall on the Dutch railway network, the court said that the ACM had not established dominance beyond a reasonable doubt, partly because the ACM had not proven that the NS behaved independently of the government, because the government also sets quality standards, has an influence on the price. So this shows that, the standard of proof is quite high. We haven't been able to say whether it's higher than EU law, but we believe it's at least not lower than EU law. And this, of course, also has an impact on effectiveness on enforcement in this area. Then the final issue that we found is that the ACM spends quite a lot of time and effort in screening signals and requests to enforce. So we had access to some of the internal data from the ACM. So signals are complaints that they get or phone calls from consumers. And there you see that it has, in 2 years that we had access to, 2020 and 2021, received over 2,600 signals, of which 388 were about abuse of dominance, of which 10% eventually were subject to an investigation. Then there is also requests to enforce, so these are a formal category, and the ACM is obliged under Dutch administrative law to actually look at these requests and motivate why it doesn't or does open an investigation. So there in those 2 years it received 33, of which 80 were subject to an initial investigation, of which in the end 5 were rejected due to a lack of priority. So here you see that this whole process of screening, signal screening, enforcement requests can take up quite some resources. You also see that there's quite a high non-priority ratio, which we also raise in our report as something that is potentially problematic. Because if you look at the requests to enforce and the ones that were rejected after initial investigation, because there was lack of priority, it's almost 60% over the relevant years. So this is a quite high number, and these are cases that could be potential abuses, but where the authority simply does not have the resources to actually investigate them. So this is also a potential problem that partly might also be up to the ACM to look at how it can more effectively redivide its resources, for instance. Then we also looked at judicial review. And this we did for a period of 24 years, from 1998 until 2022, where of the 46 cases that were subject to full investigation, the ACM adopted 8 so-called infringement decisions, 5 fines and 3 periodic penalty payment decisions. Of those 8 infringement decisions, there's only 1 infringement decision that had remained intact after review by the courts. One is two are still under review, one fining decision and one periodic penalty payment decision. What you also see is that when the ACM takes non-infringement decisions, these are mostly affirmed by the court. So 13 out of 17 have been affirmed by the Rotterdam court. Then on appeal, 7 out of 7 have been affirmed by the appeals court. So of course, the question is, what can we learn from this data? On the one hand, you can argue if ACM loses so many cases, maybe there's something wrong with how it builds its cases. On the other hand, you could also argue, you see that courts are very critical of what the ACM does. They oppose a quite high standard of proof. And also looking back at the signals and the request to enforce that it receives, it takes a lot of effort to eventually come to a case. So based on those 4 findings, we conclude that we seriously see there's reasons to seriously doubt the effectiveness of abuse of dominance enforcement in the Netherlands. So as I said at the beginning, we made 14 recommendations, partly to the ministry, but also partly to the ACM, which of course also has a role to play in making enforcement more effective. One of those was these additional instruments, and one of those additional instruments that could be looked at is the market investigation tool. So this is something that the chairman of the ACM, Martijn Snoep, you see a blog post on the left, has already been advocating for. So he, for instance, describes how the economy has changed, how it has become more concentrated, and that there are structural market problems where, despite the fact that there might be no abuse, there is still a reason to be worried and a reason to intervene. Here I should also mention that this is not only applicable in cases of abuse of dominance or in unilateral conduct cases, but that a market investigation tool could also be applied in cases, for instance, of tacit collusion. So there you see an example on the right, which is a study that the ACM published a couple of weeks ago about savings rates. So there the concern is that consumers are very much locked in to the very big Dutch banks, don't switch, and because of that, the banks also don't have incentives to increase the savings rates. So although there is no explicit coordination between the banks, there could arguably be a structural market problem as a result of which consumers lack real competition and the savings rates are very low. So as a result of this study, ACM has recommended a couple of measures to the Dutch legislator, but it could not do anything itself because there was no competition violation, so there's no competence for the ACM to act. So as a result of that, the Dutch legislator now has to potentially adopt legislation, which again takes time, for instance, to improve the ability of consumers to switch, which can be a very long process. So here you could argue maybe this is an example of a problem or a market where a market investigation tool could indeed lead to a more effective and quicker solution for consumers. And this is also where the experience with the UK market investigation tool comes in, where this has been applied in various cases already, also when there's a combination of factors that leads to market problems. So also partly on the demand side, an example was in the energy sector, where also consumers were not switching despite the fact that they could get a better deal elsewhere. So here there is not so much maybe a problem with the behavior of a firm, but the structure of the market and the fact that consumers do not switch as a whole leads to a problem for which you can argue a solution should be found. So if you look at the market investigation tool, how it could function and what it could add to the existing toolkit to potentially make this area more effective, is that it looks at market problems at the demand and the supply side, so the energy example that I just gave, and also the relationship between market players and the regulator is less adversarial. So market players may collaborate more with the regulator, and there might be less court cases after a decision is taken. So this is something that to some extent you see in the UK as well, although there are still cases also where parties go to court to act against some of the remedies that the CMA, for instance, has adopted in a market. What is also relevant is that this instrument is not, does not have a punitive character, so there's no fines imposed. There's also no question of guilt or responsibility. You simply look at the market, you try to define the cause of the problem, and then you try to design remedies that could remedy the problem. So because there is no punitive nature anymore, normally, technically, legally speaking, also these protections in the human rights setting do not apply, which means that the standard of proof should normally not be as high as they are in the regular abuse of dominance cases, which could also, again, lead to more effective interventions. One other big advantage of the market investigation tool is that the effort and time is fully spent on the design of remedies. So you don't lose time building a case, gathering evidence, trying to define an abuse of dominance, but most of the attention goes to the remedies and to the question of what is proportionate to solve the problem. One big issue is democratic legitimacy, and there probably the situation in the Netherlands will be slightly different than in the UK, where there is a different tradition. And this is indeed one of the issues that was also heavily discussed at this workshop. So can a regulator like the Dutch Competition Authority adopt market-wide remedies, forward-looking remedies, even if it does not know yet in advance to whom this would apply? So if you look at the traditional separation of powers, it's the legislator who introduces the laws, and it's the executive who applies them. Also meaning that it's the executive that has to see what is proportionate. So if you adopt market-wide remedies to unknown and to future market players, you can argue that this does not fit with this idea of separation of powers, and that it should rather be the legislator who has the democratic legitimacy to act to introduce those market-wide problems. So one solution to this could be ACM investigates a market, makes a recommendation to the legislator, and then eventually it's the legislator that acts. So this is something that could give a balance between making a market investigation tool that is effective, but also one that fits in the Dutch context where this issue of democratic legitimacy will definitely come up. Then what other lessons can we draw from the existing market investigation tools? So here I've put on the slides a comparison between the UK and the German Competition Act, where this tool was introduced last summer. Here you see that the UK tool is really very broad, whereas the German tool is actually quite narrow if you look at the provisions. So the UK is about features of a market that cause an adverse effect on competition. The German trigger is significant and continuing malfunctioning of competition, where this has to have happened for a period of at least 3 years. And also for the coming 2 years, the German Competition Authority has to show that it's not reasonable to expect the problem to solve itself. Also, the Competition Authority in Germany can only act when other powers are unlikely to be sufficient. So whereas the whole idea of the market investigation tool is you act irrespective of whether there's a violation, you can argue that this actually turns it around. So it's the competition authority that, depending on how this will be interpreted, might have to show that it cannot act on the basis of its existing powers, which could mean that its scope of action might be quite small. Then, in terms of remedies, the German Competition Act also specifies that remedies can only be addressed to undertakings who have contributed significantly to the malfunctioning of competition. So there, it's not as wide as in the UK, where you can indeed adopt market-wide remedies. Here, the German Competition Authority actually has to show that it's an undertaking that actually contributed to the problem. So I think for the Netherlands and for other potential countries that are considering to introduce a market investigation tool, it's probably the question, how can you find a middle solution? Not as broad as in the UK because of democratic legitimacy, separation of powers, but probably a bit broader than the German design. Then concluding, so the challenges of enforcement against abuses of dominance are systemic in our view. different factors, complex factors. Market investigation tool can be a welcome additional instrument, but probably in itself insufficient. And then, of course, there's also questions about the role of the EU. So should it for member states to do this, or is there a role for the Commission to coordinate this? Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much. Do we have any specific questions or perhaps experience with using the tool? Yes, go ahead, John. And we have a mic down here. Is it working?
John Davies, Competition Appeal Tribunal. Thank you, that's really interesting. There's an institutional aspect, particularly in the UK design, that you haven't touched upon, which is that when the Enterprise Act was passed, there were two competition authorities, and the Competition Commission could only run a market investigation after a reference from the OFT or from other sector regulators. And I suspect that it would not have had the broad range that it had if it were a single body taking that decision. Now, obviously, we then ended up with a single CMA, but even within that, there was the preservation of separate decision makers with the panelists. And I wonder whether that sort of institutional structure has been part of the thinking at all in the Netherlands. And indeed, I suspect that institutional structure of the panelists in the market investigations has something to do with Morten's question of how the CMA will decide between using its new powers in the market investigation regime, because although they are part of the institution in a sense, they are not reporting to the CMA board, and that does give them a different perspective, I think.
Yeah, thanks for making that point. Indeed, when we had the workshop in November in the Netherlands, this was one of the issues discussed. So who should be deciding? Should it be the Dutch Competition Authority on its own, or should there be independent experts that run the assessment and then decide or give suggestions for possible remedies? I do think then in that case still the Dutch tradition would require stronger separation. One of the suggestions also made by the Dutch Competition Authority itself is, for instance, that it could impose remedies on firms where it can establish that they have contributed to the problem, but then make a recommendation to the Dutch government, the legislator, to apply those remedies in a more market-wide manner. So this could also be a possible way to indeed navigate this, but I also see your point that institutionally you could think of different ways of making this work.
We have a question from here on the panel.
Just a very quick comment, really. Before the Enterprise Act, as I recall, the Competition Commission was not determinative, but they recommended a decision to the minister, and so that took it out of it. So there is prehistory in the UK.
Yeah.
Okay, one more question from Catherine. Maybe she can just come up here.
I was just going to compliment what John was saying, really, that the CC could take references from a regulator, and indeed did in the case of rolling stock. So that's a sort of halfway thing. And I was going to make a comment that I think, well, the two that I was involved in, market investigations, both had regulatory aspects. One was that rolling stock one, and the other was Yellow Pages, which had been subject to some regulation. So there'd be an interesting to look at where it's regulation that doesn't seem quite to have worked and where it's competition.
Okay, an important distinction. We have two, not one, we have two respondents, and firstly, thank you very much, both of you, for agreeing to participate and for your support for the event. Our first respondent is Alex Olive, and she's now General Counsel of the Payment Systems Regulator, which is very well represented among our alumni, I have to say. But she before that, she was at the Cabinet Office and doing investment screening, and before that at the CMA. So lots of broad experience. Alex, would you like?
Oh, so thank you very much. I'm now terrified of your little chiming.
I'll just wait.
So what I'm trying to do is bring together some of the threads from these really excellent talks. And the first reflection is, at first I thought I was going to get made redundant. And then I thought, it's fine, because I'll never get made redundant, because there's always another objective. And then you made me feel quite smug, actually. So there was sort of subjective reactions to each slide. But slightly more seriously, I think what we're seeing here is the value of balance and breadth. And what I'd like to highlight is it's not just about objectives. It's your objectives and your toolkit, which is exactly what you've been going to. And I think what we've seen also is a single approach, or in Jens's language, a single institution actually is never going to be the panacea. And although ideas change over time and fact patterns change over time, I do wonder whether, as long as there is a sufficient legal hook, perhaps it's your toolkit and your approach or your organizational culture that actually matters more than your objectives at the end of the day. Partly, as I'm going to talk you through, I do sometimes think that our ability to do something is already enshrined in an objective. And then perhaps, I think, as we've already heard from Catherine, it's a political steer that adds an objective, or perhaps it's a clarifying of an objective that could have been kind of construed that way in any event. Just a couple of reflections. I do think enforcement of Competition Act law is important for compliance and to use the toolkit robustly. And I would be cautious of signalling that economic regulation or market review powers are to circumvent legitimate rights of defence, or because something is just too hard. But I do agree you need both, actually. And I think this ability to find a solution without allocating blame is important in a market review context. Of course, it's not just the CMA who has market review powers. Economic regulators also have market review powers, which is quite an interesting phenomenon in the UK. We're really quite unique in that way if you look at the EU. I've had the privilege of working at Ofgem Monitor, the healthcare regulator, as it once was, now NHSI, or perhaps rebranded again, the CMA and the PSR, as well as the National Security Screening Unit. It was probably 14 years ago at Ofgem. And in those days, there was a very strong sense of the hierarchy, as we've just heard. And I think environmental factors were really sort of being thought of as a little bit of a, what do we do with these now? Because it didn't feel natural at the time. It obviously is very obvious now that environmental issues are important. Monitor, I would suggest, is actually something for a case study, because there you had competition and cooperation objectives, literally like twins. And the organisation found that very hard, and NHS Trust found that very hard to interpret on everyday bases. Of course, we can have both, but there's really a tension there to those two concepts sitting just as powerfully alongside each other. I think the CMA has a kind of very nice fluid objective that it can kind of use in different ways, and you've seen the arches of its behavioural practices change over time without really needing a new objective. And the PSR, funnily enough, is 10 years old, which I find is quite an interesting time in its curve. And it's halfway through a 5-year strategy, right? So it's actually looking at its objectives and whether it's on track to deliver according to those. So it's currently got protection projects such as fraud. It's got 2 market reviews into card schemes, pricing, as well as trying to change the structure of the market. So you can see how the different objectives are being played out there: protection, competition, and structural economics. But funnily enough, although we have a competition objective, an innovation objective, and a service user objective, which are beautifully simple and only 3, and I think they're very useful in terms of flexing, we do then have to consider sustainability, confidence in the payment systems, efficiency, the economy of a system, proportionality, sustainable growth, responsibility, 3 different ways. I think everybody in the system, including the users, have to be responsible. Recognising differences, transparency, and disclosure objectives. So that's actually a pretty large wish list, and they're filtered in not as objectives, but as relevant considerations or principles. And I think the way that a regulator uses... I actually think it works quite well, because you have 3 primary objectives, but you have some information there to guide you. And I think if we were to do a different emphasis as, you know, interests in, for example, consumer welfare may change relative to payments, or digital economy relative to payments, you actually have it there. You don't need a new one. So I think I'm sympathetic to the view that you can have too many of these Christmas tree initiatives and really perhaps look at what's already there. But standing back, I agree that sometimes perhaps they do need to be looked at. Sometimes some trimming and sometimes some re-emphasising. But it's really the toolkit alongside the objectives that I think matter. Because if you haven't got the ability to step in a way, your objectives are a little bit nugatory, redundant. It's not the point. And we can talk a lot about objectives, but really, can you do something with them? And I guess as a lawyer, I would always be quite keen to make sure that we've got the levers and the powers and an ability to provide safeguards. Right? The rights of defence are important, even if we might not want the full access to file that takes 5 years to do. So really, I think it's about a question of emphasis. So that's my whistle-stop tour of what I sort of took from that. But I don't want to use up too much time because I know it's quite a late session.
No, thank you very much. No, that was perfect, and thank you for bringing those threads all together. And we'll go ahead and have David now. David Parker is managing director now at BRG here on this line. Thank you very much. But he also comes with 25 years of experience across competition, mergers, market investigation, abusive dominance,
etc., etc.
Yes, currently with the Competition Appeals Tribunal, I believe.
Well, certainly in front of the Competition Appeals Tribunal.
In front of it, yeah, sorry.
I won't be talking about any cases I'm currently involved in. So what I wanted to do was to pick up some of the themes coming out of these papers and thinking about the new DMU. So I'm going to pick up a little bit on some of the stuff that Nico Adam was talking about earlier, and also about what Morten and Catherine were talking about, plus also the other papers as well. So I would say the first thing I'd want to put out is how incredibly radical and ambitious the DMU and the DMCC are. Is extraordinary. The CMA is going to create a bespoke regulatory regime for every SMS firm, in principle, in 9 months from the beginning. So it has to determine whether they're SMS and create a bespoke regulatory regime. One of the slides had the sort of development of Ofgem, 38 years, one sector. So just, if you think about digital markets are not all the same. Every digital market is different. If you said, let's flip it around, let's create a non-digital markets unit. Right, every large firm in the economy, we're now going to regulate in 9 months, just like that. That could lead to some issues, it seems to me. So I think this is so radical that it's not properly appreciated. Next point is even the starting point for the CMA is one of great discretion. And the starting point is who are they going to determine to be SMS and in what order? Because they just won't have the capacity to be able to go through every firm that could conceivably be SMS, which I think is essentially every firm that meets the turnover thresholds and has some kind of digital activity. So I'm pretty sure that I could find Tesco to have SMS, because Tesco has enough turnover and it sells things online. And lots of businesses, therefore, are selling things through Tesco. I'm not suggesting that that's going to be top of the CMA's priorities, but why not? What are the criteria that we are going to use to determine who gets to be first up against the wall when the revolution comes, to quote Douglas Adams? So what that's going to create, I think, and this picks up on some of the points made earlier, is an awful lot of lobbying, because it's going to be really important to say, no, I shouldn't be first on the list, they should be first on the list, because I'm wonderful and they're terrible. What that's going to create is inevitably, we saw the number of complaints that there were in the Netherlands, several hundred. We're going to have all sorts of noise, activity, lobbying of media, lobbying of government, all sorts of activity designed to try and create the view that it should be some groups first rather than others. Now, I think what we've heard in the press, at least, is that the CMA appears likely to investigate, first of all, Google, Apple, and Meta. So 3 of the gammas. So, okay, you can see why the gammas would be a natural starting point. But let's take a 4th gamma. Let's take Microsoft. Let's say you regulate Google, Apple, and Meta first, but you don't regulate Microsoft. Well, then you will be creating competitive distortions because you're regulating some people in a market and not others. So you're regulating Google, so you're going to regulate search. Microsoft's in search, but it's not regulated yet because we haven't got around to them. You're regulating Google and Apple, both of whom have operating systems. Oh, Microsoft has operating systems, but we're not regulating them yet because they're not on the list yet. You're regulating Meta, but you're not regulating Microsoft. So Meta has a marketplace. Lots of other people have marketplaces, so that's maybe Amazon you might think of as having a marketplace, but they're not on the list yet. So you can see, you think about advertising. All of these firms do advertising. Microsoft does advertising. Lots of other people do advertising. So you're creating then competitive distortions. Is that actually what we're seeking to achieve? Normally when we do a regulatory regime, we regulate everything all at once. So we find a sector, and we work out, we do a lot of work on energy, for example, to try and work out all of the interactions, and we put in place a regulatory regime across everything to try to avoid these sorts of distortions. We don't get it perfectly right, but that's kind of the plan. So I think that's going to lead to all sorts of exciting problems that I think I would say are, I'll put these down as foreseen consequences. So the next thing is, this is just about who gets to be regulated. The next thing is, how are they going to be regulated? Well, I think we have the conduct requirements, we heard about those, and the pro-competitive interventions. Both of these, I think, are so far incredibly vague. So let's just take a couple of examples. Fair dealing. The idea is that everyone will have to deal fairly with their trading partners. Well, what does that mean? Well, it could mean that all the prices that you have to charge have to be fair and indeed reasonable. And that sounds a bit like FRAND, right? Fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. What is the FRAND price for any digital service? The guidance is silent. I think there is no guidance, no broader guidelines or guidance from any other source. We know a little bit about it from patent discussions, but the way that you look at FRAND pricing in patents is you look at prices that have been set in a market. And you say, well, broadly, how should this particular transaction be set relative to these other market prices? But that's not necessarily what you mean by FRAND in one of these purely regulatory contexts. There's a case at the moment that's been all over the world between Apple and Epic, where Epic is complaining about the fact that Apple charges a 30% commission on payments. What's the FRAND price for access to Apple's customers? Ultimately, the CMA is going to have to decide, I think, what the answer is. Because it could say, Apple, as part of the SMS regime, you are going to have to treat your customers fairly. So you go and do that, and then we'll see whether we get any complaints. So one world is the CMA says, well, no, this is the answer, it's 27.3%. But I think if I was the CMA, I wouldn't want to commit to that early on. So I'd say, I'll put the problem back on Apple and say, you have to act fairly and reasonably. Okay, so you do that, and then hope that should solve the problem. And Apple will come back with a number, and Epic will say, oh, that's not fair. No. Because the fair number is very much reduced. And so either the CMA will have to take a view, anything else is just kicking the can down the road. But the CMA is going to have to do that for every single price in the digital economy, in principle, that could apply to an SMS firm. As I say, radical, ambitious. Let's think about open choices. You have to be able to choose freely and without any sort of switching costs between different services. Well, what does that mean? Let's take an example. Let's suppose I am a standalone mapping provider. And I go to the CMA and I say, it's absolutely outrageous that Google includes a map when you're searching for something, it gives you a map and you can click on it. And this is terrible because they should essentially not be allowed to offer a map, or they should offer a choice of maps, including mine, whenever they set up a search result. That starts getting quite close to essentially unbundling lots of services. Here's my phone, it's got a camera in. Should you be able, that choice is being made for me by Apple. Should you unbundle that? It's a digital service. We'll see where that gets to, but you can imagine, going back to the lobbying point, that can lead to all sorts of lobbying by people who previously offered a standalone product that other firms are now bundling together. Last point, adverse effects on competition. It's a very vague concept. What do we actually mean by that? Well, I think there's a good version and there's a problematic version. The good version is there is a feature that leads to a market failure, and if we resolve the feature, then that can resolve the market failure. So, and then competitive outcomes should improve. And that's how I think things used to be done in the UK, but I don't think it's really how it works anymore. So it used to be the case that you might say, well, the feature is that people face switching costs, and then what we'll try and do is reduce those switching costs. And we identify something and then we target it. We target an intervention precisely at that feature. Now, I think where we've slightly ended up is we have set up an adverse effect on competition as being something we would like to see, but that isn't necessarily at all realistic. So, in the buses inquiry, one of the features that was seen to be problematic was that there are lots of bus routes that don't have two providers on it. But if you think about bus routes, that's never going to happen, that you get two providers on everything, because if you've got two providers, you'll never get a bus going to everyone's house. So as soon as you have, let's suppose you start with a world where two bus routes are exactly on, exactly overlapping, two firms on exactly the same bus route. One firm will always have an incentive to go and serve this group of houses over here where no one else is, and the other firm might go and serve this group of houses over here where no one else is. So your competition will drive you to having lots of routes for where there's only one bus. Now, the CMA said that's a problem because we don't like situations where there's only one. But that is the outcome of competition in a world where there's some fixed cost to running a bus and there's geographic differentiation. And if you can solve the problem of making buses free, that would resolve the problem. Or if you can make sure that everyone only lives on one road, that would solve the problem as well. But you can't solve that adverse effect on competition because that is not a resolvable situation. It is an unrealistic counterfactual. And so there's a real danger, I think. So let's say, let's go back to search. The argument is Google is dominant in search because search has network effects. So more people search on Google, and therefore Google gets information on what people want from their searches. Google can improve its product more quickly than other search engines, so it's higher quality. In that world, and then we care about high quality searches, right, when we're using our search engine, because that's what we prefer. But let's suppose we say, well, that outcome is problematic. And that's our adverse effect on competition, because sometimes often the sort of market structure is taken to be an outcome, but an adverse effect on competition by itself. So the adverse effect on competition is there's basically only one Google. But the reason that there's only one Google is because it is higher quality, because there's this fundamental feature of more, that if you believe the tipping point argument, that's what competition delivers. So that is an actual outcome of competition, an AOC rather than an AEC. You can't solve an outcome of competition by saying, well, let's make the network effects go away. So you have to, I think, be realistic about what you can do with these powers. I think a particularly concerning thing about the DMU is where you have outcome requirements. Let's say you're saying, right, well, Google, you've got to make sure that your share falls to 60% as a result of various things. Well, how can you stop people using you? Do you say, well, no, we're full up now. It's the 22nd of this month. We've had enough searches. We're shutting Google in the UK until the 1st of July. That would solve the problem. But would it make customers better off? Would it improve the world? That's a different issue. But would Google be on the hook for 10% of global turnover if they violate their pro-competitive intervention powers? Maybe it would. So it seems to me we will see where we end up, but I foresee an enormous amount of lobbying, all sorts of foreseen but unforeseen consequences, and I think this is an excellent scope for future research papers to think actually realistically how is this all going to work when we haven't really clearly articulated what the problems are, and the problems are going to be very bespoke and different in every circumstance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Yes, we don't have a theory of harm, or 25 theories of harm, or 500 theories of harm to direct exactly what it is that it needs to be done. Yeah. But we do have democracy, education, a whole lot of things other than economic stuff that we care about. So that might help. I stifled a lot of people's questions earlier during the thing, so I'm going to open it up. We have time before our illustrious keynote. I see Farasat very eagerly back there, if we can get a mic. But also, those of you on the panel, if you have comments to respond to your respondents now, feel free to jump in.
Sorry, so just one quick question. I mean, I hear the problem that you're raising, but I also don't understand that, yes, there are network effects, there are tipping points, but it can't possibly be that there are no remedies, that the only alternative remedy is to shut down Google for a certain number of days. There are other remedies that one could think of.
So I was obviously being rather flippant about that as the solution. So I guess the question is, if network effects, in this case, improve the quality of the product, anything you do to unwind the network effect, however you do that, will undermine the quality of the product.
No.
I feel Jens burning to jump in on this. Go ahead.
I mean, sorry, very specifically. So because I wrote the paper in 2012, which proves you wrong. So the
okay.
so the trick here is mandatory data sharing. So that's in today's world, that is a little bit a different world than 10 years ago. So it will not be the silver bullet, but kind of. And by the way, this is because of our work. This is in the DMA. So so there's this. Google will have right now has to share kind of its click and query data with competitors, and we have empirical data on top of the theory, a kind of empirical work on top of the theory that shows that kind of if smaller search engines do have access to more of this click and query data, in particular about tail queries, kind of unknown queries, but they have very little data, then this will continuously improve their quality. This is by far kind of. I've had a look at this now for the past 15 years or so. By far the most promising kind of intervention. Whether, as I said, it's no silver bullet because these days Google also has other means and they have much more deeper pockets and better technology and smarter people and whatever. But kind of that is something kind of how you can regulate the search engine market without deteriorating Google's quality 1 inch.
So I agree with that. I think it slightly takes the problem up a level, possibly 2. So the first level is the DMA requires Google to provide that on a FRAND basis. What is the FRAND price for Google's data?
Marginal cost, which is 0.
And then there's a further issue, and you may just say, this is where we are. Obviously, that's essentially expropriation, right, of Google's investments.
No, it's not, because they never invested in the click and query data. That's a fundamental misunderstanding. The click and query data are a byproduct of running a search engine, right? So somebody comes and says, I'm looking for this. And then in exchange, you tell them, oh, why don't you click on this? Why don't you click on that? These days, you use Gemini or whatever, kind of in order to give them more elaborate answers. But the thing is kind of that it is a byproduct that this search engine that is used, and only this one, kind of gets the details about the background, the characteristics, and the preferences of this one one user. And that's, yeah, so this is nothing that they have invested in. They have invested in a search engine and in an algorithm.
In index.
It does actually highlight, it comes back to the value of objectives, right? It actually, to solve this debate, you have to go back to what am I trying to achieve? And then I think perhaps the objectives offer a little bit of a false comfort because it's a nice idea, but then you highlight the how. And it's the how do you achieve your objective is where it gets hard, right?
Yeah, and I don't work for Google, just to be clear, so I've no skin in this game, but it will clearly have, you can say, to question whether it's a byproduct or whether it's a consequence of the investment you make in crawling the web and doing all the other things that Google does. But let's say that is the world, then I think you have to look at the incentives. I mean, it's essentially a windfall tax in a way, right? Who is going to be the first person with the next? Let's suppose I'm thinking about AI. Let's say, well, as a result of some AI investment in the future, the lesson from Google will be, is if I do well, I just have to give it to everyone else. You can see that people may at least think that as being a partial, some incentive reduction on trying to do well on the next thing, because there'll be then a lot of lobbying saying, oh, well, they've done the best, they've got this advantage, I'd like that. For free would be nice, because marginal cost is 0. So thanks very much. So I just think we need to sort of bear in mind these trade-offs. I don't think there's a kind of a simple answer.
If I may, 2 sentences. I mean, you're generalizing very, very much, right? So the data sharing argument or proposal is really only about kind of the raw data that were obtained for free as a byproduct. Nobody ever has anybody suggested that process data be shared or that even an algorithm be shared. Some stupid people have done it, but we have not done it. So that's and that can address the problem exactly without kind of affecting the incentive problem of the innovator. So Google will not say, oh, we don't do AI, because it could be that if we get some data about customers' preferences, that we have to share them with another firm. They make tons of money with it, and that's their objective function, not give me the data. Data is only a means. Okay.
It could also be that another firm, given the opportunity to access that data, might redefine what counts as quality, because at the moment we only have, that idea of what is quality, and we don't really know. And when we think about systemic risks from very large online platforms, we are actually looking at, okay, what are the outcomes of it, and what is the... So there is quite a push to stop counting simple engagement as the mark of quality in relation to whatever algorithms spit out. And so given access to all of that byproduct, which comes from us, perhaps there's possibility for more innovation from other people.
Yes.
That doesn't mean that it's not a very complicated thing what the DMU is supposed to be doing. So do we have some other questions? I think there was more in the back. Sean, I did cut you off earlier. Did you want to?
No,
we've passed the moment, sorry. So do we have any other questions from the floor or responses from our panelists? Questions, Morten?
Well, I mean, maybe just one comment to Inge. As Catherine reminded us, a number of the market investigations we've had over the years in the UK have, in the background somewhere, a regulator. And not very many of them are actually markets where you go, gosh, there is really no obvious competition way of dealing with it. The most obvious one are funeral services. Which I always thought was a fantastically brilliant market investigation to undertake, because you could see what the problem was. You could see that there was no way you could fit it into Chapter 1 or Chapter 2, or 101, 102. So it's possibly worth going back and having a look at that, because if there's already somebody there whose job it is to bite them in the leg, then what are they doing? The other thing I might just want to challenge is the idea that it's much better to have market investigations than 102. if one was really pragmatic about this, and if you really had a monopolist, then harassing them a bit to get them off their maximum is not going to cost them very much. That's the envelope theorem. But it's going to gain you a lot of welfare. But getting them down to marginal costs is going to be really hard, and that's much more what you're likely to do when it comes to a market investigation. So they might actually fight you harder, so long as you keep your 102 to a kind of threat that you might do something rather than actually going ahead and doing it. So it's just to say that it's not necessarily obvious that it's a better tool.
I would agree that there can be some false assumptions about the differences and the benefits of each tool, because, I mean, there's a sort of, it's so hard to get 1 or 2 out the door. I mean, I've done some myself, they're hard work, but they do have an end eventually. But it's the appeal route, and maybe the standards that you've described are actually, or at least the approach of the court may well be leading to a pattern that doesn't lead to the right place. But it's not a slam dunk that a market review or a market investigation will be particularly quicker or particularly easier to land a successful remedy. So either you get appealed as well, either you have to really work hard to demonstrate why your remedy is right and doesn't have unintended consequences and does provide the right rights of defence. The benefit is sometimes that you're working with industry, not against a small number of players or one player. So that can change the dynamic a lot. Perhaps data is really important, and participation in designing a solution is really important. And then a market review or investigation can be quite powerful. But I think there are often some sort of assumptions about these different things when there's a large overlap of some of the spirit of them, at least, both in process and ultimate outcomes that you're trying to achieve, other than this sort of punitive element. But I also think a punitive element is quite important for the other participants in the market, right? That, it's not just that case law is case by case. Case law sort of establishes a rule for everyone to pay attention to in theory. Sorry, I didn't know you could chip in.
No, of course. So my experience would be that regulators tend to use the lever that is the easiest for achieving the outcome that they would like to. So about 10 years ago, there was a big debate that there had been concurrent powers for all of the regulators, and the regulators had never used the concurrent powers or incredibly rarely, because it was much easier to change license conditions through a regulatory inquiry to achieve that outcome. And so I think what we'll see in something like in the DMU context, my expectation would be that the CMA would tend to reach for the DMU powers and to do a pro-competitive intervention there, because they can get something done in 9 months and it's just done. And it's for a specific firm, let's tackle them, we'll deal with that. I think we will probably see, I can't really imagine why the circumstances in which the CMA would think it would be worth trying to run an Article 102, Chapter 2 case against a big tech firm when you could just find them SMS and put in place some kind of conduct requirement or pro-competitive intervention.
That's why it exists.
That's the whole point of it, is to make it easier to do that, to not have to have merits review. You know, I think that feels like a reasonable prediction to me.
Yeah, so just to follow up on this, so indeed I see the point that a market investigation tool is not always a silver bullet for everything. Of course, it has been discussed as well at the time the DMA was adopted, whether we should have a new competition tool, it was called, at the EU level. And in that process, there was also a response made by the UK CMA, like describing the experience, the pros and cons of the market investigation tool in the UK. And indeed, there also these things were mentioned, like it can still take quite long, it can be complex to design the right remedies. There's a lot of pressure also when you open a market investigation tool to come with the right solution at the end. View in this study was indeed to investigate whether it's desirable as an additional tool, as a complement. And that does not mean that this is the only solution. So other elements, I think that is what the problem in the Netherlands shows, that there's really a systemic issue from the number of signals the competition authority gets, to the very high standard of proof. So it's a complex mix of factors that come together and that create the situation where we are now in, where you can really ask yourself whether there is still effective enforcement. So we probably also need a reflection on what is the right standard of proof. Is it indeed too high, and why? How has it happened that it is so high? Maybe there's a good reason for it. Maybe it's really a bottleneck and needs to be addressed. Then of course there's also things that the competition authority itself should do. Does it allocate resources efficiently? So it's a mix of circumstances, and there maybe market investigation tool can add a bit of flexibility, can address some of the issues, but probably not all of them. But of course, having a broader toolkit makes the authority more flexible, but it also adds a lot of responsibility and need to balance rights of defense and
You should definitely get it.
I mean, I think they do fill a gap, so I am in favour of them, because I think they pick a different set of problems to the ones that you can deal with in abusive dominance, particularly if you do have some kind of genuine market failure resulting from, I don't know, some coordination issue or some externality and so on, then that's something, it wouldn't be right to say this is a problem of a particular firm. It's a problem of a market as a whole, and you need a market-wide tool to be able to deal with it. I do have a bit of a concern, just back on my DMU hat, that doing this in 9 months is going to be really hard, because we used to take 18 months to 2 years, and the last 6 months of that was remedies, was provisional findings and remedies. So we've now got, of our 9 months, after 3 months we essentially need to have come up with the answer, and then so you almost have to go in with an idea of what the answer is first, and then maybe write it up, which is not really an investigation. It's just, we've decided we're going to do something, and here's what it is. Or we'll call it, we'll call it a pro-competitive intervention, and there's notionally this discussion, but not really.
Okay, thank you very much. And if PCIs and market investigations fail, you can always call in the mafia, right? And keep them blind. Okay, thank you.
That's for a reason,
Yeah, we have one more wonderful moment to finish off, and I would like to invite John Davies, our keynote speaker, up. And do you want to?
What do you want us to do? Sit here or sit?
Peter, I'm looking at Peter. We just sit right here. Thank you very much, respondents and panelists. If we can hang out here. John Davies, you have noticed him asking brilliant questions throughout the day and yesterday already. He comes to us from the Competition Appeal Tribunal and is an independent economist, lots of experience across Competition Commission in the European context and at the OECD. Finish us off with some brilliant work.
Brilliant work, goodness. Well, I should perhaps start with the same disclaimer as Catherine did, that I'm going to certainly echo many of the themes that have already been covered. Occupational hazard of going last. The other occupational hazard of going last is that I'm keeping you from drinks and indeed from the entire rest of your lives. So I shall try to be reasonably brief. I'm a member of the UK Competition Appeal Tribunal, but I'm speaking in a personal capacity, and in any case, I'm not actually talking about anything to do with the CAT. I'm going to be talking about the regulation of gatekeepers under the EU's DMA. So I should mention that before joining the CAT last summer, I worked as a consultant, and in that role I worked for Amazon, and I also worked extensively against Apple for complainants such as Spotify and Epic. I have no continuing interests in any of that. To a sector regulator, the EU's DMA must look extraordinarily light touch. It is regulation designed by a competition enforcer. It's enforced through deterrence. Gatekeepers in breach can be fined 10% of their global turnover, 20% for repeated offences, which would be the EU budget sorted out for a few years, I suppose. And the Commission has also said it will pursue break-up if companies do not comply. Furthermore, harmed users can sue for damages. In the famous phrase, it is supposed to be largely self-executing.
That particularly applies to Article 5, which are simple rules, but also to Article 6, which contains reforms that, in the famous phrase, are capable of being further specified. And earlier this year, gatekeepers had to specify them in submitting plans for how they intend to comply. One example of such a plan, as we've heard, relates to Apple's App Store, which I'm going to use as an example, not because I used to work on that matter, but more because it has clearer monopoly characteristics than some of the other services. The only way to install apps on an iPhone has been through Apple's App Store. So, in a market defined as app distribution on the iOS system, Apple has a complete monopoly. Apple, of course, disputes that market definition. It says the market is wider and includes Android phones, creating an indirect constraint on Apple, but competition authorities have largely rejected that. Article 6.4 requires Apple to make it possible to download apps through other routes. Apple's plan gave app developers a choice. They can stick with Apple, or they can use competing app stores, but if they do the latter, their payment terms change. In particular, all apps with more than 1 million downloads must pay Apple something if they're on the second plan, so popular free apps which pay nothing now would lose out by switching to competing app stores. And competing app stores' apps themselves, the app that is the App Store, must pay Apple from the very first download. Furthermore, end users receive warning messages if they install a competing app store. And finally, competing app stores still have to conform to certain criteria set by Apple. For example, they cannot publish only the App Store's own apps. Said the word app way too much in that paragraph. Lots of companies, such as Spotify and Epic, have been very critical of this plan. Others have been more supportive, but the Commission was not, and it has launched an investigation into whether this plan is compliant with the DMA. Now, I don't know where that's going to end up, but I want to think about what all this means for the Commission's hopes of staying hands-off and relying upon deterrence. I have two questions. First of all, what if it doesn't work? What if the Commission finally approves some version of Apple's plan, but then nobody starts using other app stores? The DMA says the plans must be effective in achieving the objectives of the DMA, which are fairness and contestability. No doubt there would be a big legal fight over whether lack of competition indicates the measures were not effective. As Micova said earlier, the assessment criteria are unclear, but most likely, in these circumstances, the Commission would try to find some way of going back to have another go. Second, what if it does work? Suppose lots of apps and customers move to competing app stores. That fundamentally changes Apple's business model. So maybe it would need something like the new charging structure, but are those charges fair? To answer that, the Commission has to get involved in assessing access pricing in the way that, in the way that we heard about in the previous panel. Other regulators have faced these problems in the past. I'm going to take as an example another attempt to introduce competing services over a large two-sided platform, a platform that had market power and millions of daily users. Regulators of that platform hoped to keep things simple, but they ended up in more and more detailed regulation as competition developed. The platform I have in mind was called British Gas, and the year I want to begin is 1986. In 1986, the Thatcher government privatised British Gas as a vertically integrated monopoly. It bought gas on long-term contracts, it transported and it stored the gas, and it sold gas to end consumers. That structure wasn't because no one thought about competition. The Treasury and various academic economists pushed for it, but the government, as we've heard, wanted a quick sale. They needed the privatisation proceeds, and Peter Walker, the Secretary of State for Energy, was no Thatcherite, and he wanted a national champion. It wasn't entirely a statutory monopoly. The very largest industrial users could, in theory, choose alternative gas suppliers, and they had been able to since 1982. But few, if any, did. Why not? Well, various reasons, but among them, first, there was a total lack of clarity over the terms under which BG would transport a competitor's gas. And second, BG was completely unregulated in this large industrial users market, so it could simply undercut any competing offer. So how did competition develop? Well, it took repeated, increasingly heavy-handed intervention by regulators and increasingly detailed regulatory involvement in the industry, as I'll explain. Less than a year after privatisation, BG was referred to the Monopolies and Mergers Commission. The MMC found that competition for large industrial users was not developing and recommended a set of remedies. These included a requirement for BG to publish conditions for third-party access to its pipelines. They also included what Dieter Helm, whose book, by the way, I relied upon heavily for this part of the talk, has called regulatory handicapping, restrictions on BG's ability to compete. For example, BG had to publish prices for large industrial users, so it could not simply undercut a competitor, and it could not contract for more than 90% of any new gas field. Heavy-handed intervention going well beyond simply opening up the market, contestably to competition. The OFT reviewed these remedies in 1991 and found something that I think is very interesting for today's DMA. It found that BG had complied with the remedies, but it found that those remedies were not effective in creating competition. It proposed various solutions, again quite heavy-handed, such as BG releasing gas at cost to its competitors. And after that, there was a complicated process, at the end of which the regulator, Ofgas, the OFT, and BG itself, slightly foolishly, agreed to go back to the MMC for another go. This second MMC inquiry recommended in 1993 that the customer threshold for competition be very substantially reduced and that BG split its monopoly pipeline business from competitive supply. However, the MMC was only advisory in those days, so the decision was for government. The Thatcherites were now firmly in charge by this time, even though Thatcher was gone, as was Peter Walker. He'd joined the board of British Gas, lucky chap. And in the end, BG was not required to divest completely, but in exchange, the timetable for real competition was massively accelerated to all customers by 1998. BG also had market share targets to reduce its market share of the contestable parts of the market. But fortunately, unlike David's example of Google, it did not simply do so by abandoning the market for a few months. But again, very heavy-handed, very direct intervention by the regulators to try to force competition into the market. Now, this timetable to competition created several huge regulatory challenges. BG was barely coping with the occasional transfer of a big customer to a rival. It was not ready for thousands, let alone millions, of customers to switch to competitors. One problem was management of the system. Competitors had no responsibility or incentives to balance the system. BG did that. In the new competitive world, this couldn't work. BG needed competing suppliers to pay the system costs that their activities actually imposed. And for their part, competitors needed clear rights and charges for access, and they needed to be paid themselves for any system benefits that their actions produced. None of this was in place. So in 1994, BG convened a conference to create the framework that became known as the Gas Network Code. At that conference, the new entrants complained that the terms for using BG's network were unclear, that the playing field was tipped against them. That was the phrase that was always used. We need a level playing field. However, BG complained that the playing field was tipped the other way, that these new entrants were free-riding and they were picking cherries as they did so, if I can mix my metaphors. I was there in a very junior capacity, sitting at the back, gradually losing sympathy with my clients, who were the new entrants, and gaining more and more sympathy for British Gas. But never mind my role. What is extraordinary from today's perspective about that conference, which was there to establish the third-party access regime for the British gas industry, is that Ofgas, the regulator, had no formal role. It didn't want one. It said to the industry, you sort this out amongst yourselves. We'll just approve or disapprove. In the event, an Ofgas delegation did turn up, and it was not at all keen to express any views during the debate. The head of the delegation did occasionally indicate informally what he thought. In fact, it was the first time I'd ever heard the word minded used by a regulator, but Ofgas wanted to stay out of the detail. It did not succeed. As the days went on, Ofgas was more and more often appealed to, asked what it was minded to do, and in retrospect, this was surely inevitable. There were two sides, at least, and someone had to arbitrate between the two. And if you look at what is now called the Uniform Network Code, today it is 640 pages long, I think, and although the process remains collaborative, Ofgem, as the regulator is now called, is very much in charge. It decides upon changes, and there is a formal appeal process for those changes to the CMA. And that is just one example of the complexity and close Ofgem involvement in the detailed operation of the sector. So to get to gas competition in the UK, off-gas, off-gem had to do two things. At the start, it had to push pretty hard with regulatory handicapping, restricting BG's freedom to compete, deliberately tilting the playing field against it. Second, it had to intervene in detail and to continue to regulate in detail. I suspect this was inevitable, because each new push for liberalisation creates more points of contact between the competitive parts of the sector and the remaining monopoly parts, and those need regulating. And then some of those fixes create further problems too, and so more regulation comes in to fix those, and so how it goes. There's a logic to increasing regulation that, just as Martin Cave put it, grows and grows and grows. And just as Martin said yesterday, that was not what the British regulators wanted. They started with a very clean and simple vision of hands-off regulation. Regulate the monopoly elements, make sure they don't distort the competitive elements, be present to adjudicate complaints if they arrive, and stand back while competition develops. But it did not happen that way. So what does all this mean for the DMA and the Commission's hopes for self-executing clauses? Well, obviously digital markets are very different from gas for various reasons that Morten, for example, talked about. One of them is because of innovation. However, to my mind, innovation in the digital sector makes the problem even harder because regulators face a moving target, so they have less time to deal with the issues. Apple's initial compliance plan does remind me of the early days of gas competition. App developers are complaining about the costs and the ease and the mechanisms for third-party access, while Apple complains about free riders on its investment. The Commission is already quite involved through its non-compliance investigation, and there are clear penalties in place, but the DMA does not give the Commission the flexibility that the UK policy system had back in the 1990s to find remedies to achieve quite generic objectives to introduce competition. So I wonder whether the DMA is actually well suited to the more ambitious objectives the Commission has established and how realistic indeed those ambitions are. I wish I could conclude with a solution. I don't have one. Just like Anika in the earlier session, I think that the UK's more bespoke company-by-company approach will actually work a little better. I also think that many of the DMA's Article 5 rules may work perfectly well, even if some of the bigger picture changes that the Commission is aiming for with Article 6 don't really come about. Maybe that's enough. Many people would say that it is. But my guess is that the Commission itself will want to press on, surfing a wave of complaints from wannabe competitors. If so, it may well find itself having to regulate in detail and in depth, setting access conditions and prices just like a sector regulator, which you could see as a good thing, or you could see as a bad thing, but it is not what the Commission wanted. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And do we have questions now, or do we? Sean, would you like?
If we would like to.
Yeah, would anyone like to ask? No.
Back to the 80s.
If not, in that case, let Sean, our CCP Director, Fearless Leader, close us off. Thank you very much, John, and thank you very much to all of our presenters. Sean, would you?
Okay, I would like to, I don't know if you can hear me through the speaker or online, but I would like to thank everyone who's been involved with this conference, first of all, because I think we've had a large number of people who've made a very substantial effort to speak and to comment and listen and to actually make the logistics of this event happen. And it's really been a fantastic effort by everybody. I wanted to celebrate that. So thanks so much. We are going to have another conference next year. And we don't have the dates for that yet, but But stay tuned. Please make sure that you subscribe to you can subscribe to the CCP news information, which will tell you quite soon, actually, when that date would be. So if you wanted to set it aside, that's a possibility. And maybe just want to give a special word of thanks to Peter Courage and Juliet Hardman, who have been absolutely instrumental in making this happen. So please join me. Okay, and then the audio video team here has been great. Thank you. They've come all the way from Norwich. Okay, and I think they've made the experience very positive for the people online, so it's really been fantastic. I've heard great things coming back. And with that, I think that we may have a little bit of refreshment attending us outside, so please do feel free to stick around. Thank you.